to me, O Muse. The Odyssey, an original adaptation written and retold for you by Jon Buckeridge. Chapter 11. Scylla and Charybdis. In the great hall at Ithaca, Antinous, unspoken leader of the suitors, was not happy, but he never let it show. Don't show them a moment's weakness, he told himself, but always be on the lookout for theirs. He looked across the sea of suitors, all eating and drinking and having a merry old time of it. He looked up at the balcony above the hall, where Penelope gazed over them, her calm resolve a brittle mask Antinous knew was almost ready to break. Why should I, he thought, have to compete with the likes of these poor examples of manliness for a prize like that? He stared at Penelope. She really was beautiful, for an older woman, but Antinous had no shortage of beauties vying for his attention. What really attracted him to her was what she brought with her. Power. Control Penelope, and you control the throne of Ithaca, and that was a prize worth having, even if you had to compete with idiots like these. "Do you know," he said to Eurymachus, sitting next to him, "I believe that none of these men really care about marrying Penelope." Eurymachus looked at him in surprise, but a large mouthful of pork stopped him from responding, so Antinous went on. "Oh, they'll be happy enough if she picks them, and enjoy the power and wealth and other benefits. But they'll just as quickly call it a day and go home if she says no. I think they're mostly here for the free food." "Well," said Eurymachus, finally gulping down his meat, "they've got a point, haven't they? I mean, we can't all have her, can we? She can only pick one." "But if they really cared about it," replied Antinous, "they'd make sure it was them. And if they really cared, then when they got the prize they wouldn't give it up quickly." He scanned the crowd again. Whenever any of the suitors looked back at them, he'd smile, but it was brief and brittle. As soon as Telemachus comes to his throne, then Penelope's new husband is just Penelope's new husband. But if he never takes the throne— He left that sentence unfinished. "Never show them your hand," he told himself. "Telemachus is at sea. The sea is a dangerous place, and better men than him have fallen victim to storms or pirates." He let that sentence trail off too. "I'm sure that if Telemachus were never to return, then Penelope would be completely distraught, in need of comfort, and would soon make her choice." Eurymachus grinned up at him, and a dull glint entered his eye. "He's brighter than the rest," thought Antinous to himself. "I shall have to keep a close watch on him." For the time being, though, he grinned back, without it reaching his eyes. "I think we understand each other, do we not?" he said, and Eurymachus nodded. "Good. Circulate the plan through the suitors, and make arrangements." Antinous was right when he said the sea was a dangerous place, and far away in the great hall of Phaeacia stood a man who knew that better than most. Odysseus looked at the crowd of faces surrounding him. Throughout his story, as he'd passed through monsters and magic, through death and destruction, through trial and temptation, the Phaeacians had drunk in his words with a captivated focus. Odysseus was something of a showman, and he knew how to tell a tale properly. But still he was grateful to these people, as they gave his story the reverence and respect it needed, the respect it deserved. He smiled at them broadly. "I'm drawing towards the end of my tale now, good people of Phaeacia, and I have just a few stories left to share." There was no small number of dejected groans at this news. "The next stage of our journey was perhaps the most formidable test to our bravery." "The pass of Scylla and Charybdis?" asked King Alcinous. "The pass of Scylla and Charybdis," Odysseus agreed. Even now, thinking of it 7 years on, his hands began to shake slightly. He shut his eyes and forced himself to remember. On escaping the island of the Sirens, the Ithacans sailed towards the pass of Scylla and Charybdis. Odysseus had agonized within himself whether to tell the men what they were going to face there, but eventually he decided no. What good was there in telling them that some of them would certainly die that day? What possible gain would there be in knowing that sooner? How could he make their lives a moment better by sharing the burden of knowledge he alone carried? Despite Tiresias's words, though, he had the men don their full armour and war gear as they came towards the pass. May as well give them that much, he thought. At least if we die, we shall die as warriors. Soon the great cliffs of the passage came into view. "Steady as she goes, pilot," Odysseus told the steersman, "and keep us on the left throughout this passage." The cliffs loomed high above the Ithacan ship, and the channel between them was inky black. As the ship sailed on, the tension within Odysseus grew. Somehow, knowing something was coming made it worse because he didn't know when. Schooling himself to calm, he held his nerve a while longer as their ship crept through the sun-forsaken pass. He kept his eyes on the cliffs to the left, waiting for any sign of the monster Scylla launching her attack. "To the right!" came a voice, and Odysseus's head whipped round as he saw the water to the side of their ship begin to bubble and boil. It rushed and swirled past them, moving faster and faster until the surface of the sea opened like the mouth of a great creature, gasping and hungry. "It's got us!" cried the pilot, and Odysseus saw that despite their efforts to skirt the threat, their ship had lurched violently to the right. The swirling monster, Charybdis, was dragging their ship towards the centre of her vortex. "To oars, men!" yelled Odysseus. "Row for your lives, or that creature will have us all!" Running to a bench, he joined his men in heaving at the oars. Gradually, yard by yard, the Ithacan ship began to escape the swirling suction of Charybdis's maw. "We're doing it!" yelled Odysseus. "Keep hauling, men!" At that moment, though, there was a scream beside him, and Odysseus looked up to see a pair of legs whip past as one of his men was dragged right off his bench and high up into the sky above them. Searching the cliff edge, he saw a long black tendril had snaked its way down the cliff face and swept the man away. The Ithacans stared in impotent shock, completely unable to aid their comrade as he screamed his last breaths away. Odysseus blinked, and as he did, he was back in Troy. They were up against the mighty walls, trying to find a weakness that could not be found, and all around him his men were being slaughtered by rocks, arrows, and oil, hurled down from the Trojans above. "We're slipping!" The voice cut through his remembrance, and Odysseus blinked again, back in the boat. The pilot was yelling and pointing to the right. The monster Charybdis had forced their ship closer to her churning jaws. In the shock of Scylla's attack, the men had stopped their rowing. "Heave, men!" yelled Odysseus. "Row for your lives!" And they hauled at their oars once more. Another man screamed as Scylla's tendrils took him, but the Ithacans had to keep rowing or Charybdis would have them all. Another man went, and another, but all the Ithacans could do was row and wonder which one of them would be taken next. Odysseus blinked again, and once again he was back in Troy. The Greeks were hauling forward a massive battering ram at the gates of the city. Counting their steps, the Greeks hauled and heaved the ram against the gates, once, twice, a third time, but still it held firm. "Heave, men!" came a voice from the back, as the Greeks kept on hammering at the unconquerable gates. Suddenly, screams began to rise up from around him as death came from above. Boiling oil was raining down upon them, and where it struck the Greeks, they would collapse with cries of agony. Odysseus dared to look up, and saw an archer leaning out over the walls, a flaming arrow nocked to his bow. As Odysseus stared, helpless, the archer took his aim at a patch of freshly dropped oil and loosed flaming death towards them. On the ship there was another scream, and Odysseus was torn back to his senses as another of Scylla's tendrils ripped the pilot away from the ship's rudder, his legs still kicking. Lunging from his seat, Odysseus grabbed hold of the tiller and wrestled the current to keep them on course. "Keep hauling, men!" he yelled. "We're nearly free from the pull!" And indeed they were. Despite their shock and the horrific attacks from Scylla all around them, the Ithacans had nearly rowed themselves clear of Charybdis's foaming whirl. As he threw his weight on the rudder to hold their course, the men fought for their freedom inch by inch. "Yes, men!" cried Odysseus. "We're out of her grip!" Heaving sighs of relief, the men collapsed over their oars, gasping for breath, wheezing and weeping openly. Odysseus could see from their eyes that he was not the only man who had been brought back to the horrors of Troy in that moment. "Well done, men. I'm proud of you," he told them all. "That was no easy—" A scream cut his sentence in half as a final black tendril lunged forward and grabbed Perimedes by the ankle. Odysseus stood, paralysed in shock, as Perimedes was lifted high above their heads and dragged away. The whole thing was over in less than a second, but to Odysseus it was a day, a week, a lifetime. His eyes locked with Perimedes as the struggling man called down for aid he knew they could not give, and was gone. Silence reigned on the ship. In the great hall at Phaeacia, silence reigned too. Tears streamed down Odysseus's cheeks at the memory, and it wasn't just his hands that were shaking now. Without a word, Queen Arete rose from her seat, crossed the chamber, and enfolded Odysseus in her arms. Odysseus clung to the woman as she held him tightly like a wounded child, and in the back of his mind he realized this was the first real hug he had had in 20 years since he left home. He gripped her tighter still.